Greetings to everyone to the series of reflections on the teachings of Jesus Christ. In the last three sessions, we have been focused on Jesus' self revelation of himself, as found in the sixth verse of the 14th chapter of John's Gospel, where Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. We have covered the idea of Jesus being the way, the truth, and today we focus on what it means to believe that Jesus is the life. All through human history, humankind has been aware of the fact that there is an aspect to one's existence in this world which goes beyond the concerns and the means of this world. Corresponding to this, they also have been feeling that the life they lead falls short of the desired ideal state or true life. So, the distance or chasm widens between our mere existence on planet Earth and our right to live life in its fullness, which is the spiritual goal that Jesus prescribes. Take the case of the Greeks, for example, as far as this realization is concerned. The Greek philosophers embraced a very simple way of life. Many of them chose to be celibates because they wanted to transcend the mundane concerns and obsessions of ordinary people and attain to higher interests and a higher quality of life, the ideal life. Or take an example from the Indian context. Lord Buddha, who was a prince who could have lived a life of pleasure, he renounces that world of pleasure which most people covet and embraces a world of seeming deprivation, indeed of unimaginable physical privation, in search of something which he deems to be universal and of lasting value. So, this intuition that the life that most people live is really no life, or is at best a faint reflection of life as though in a cracked mirror, has been there in various cultures, in various people, various ages. And this comes to its full revelation in the life, person, and the public ministry of Jesus Christ. So, this is what we are trying to understand. But I have to say a word of caution before I proceed further. When I say we are trying to understand Jesus Christ, I have to emphasize that Jesus is not a concept, Jesus is not a mere episode. Jesus is a profound revelation of God's mystery in this world, and therefore, he cannot be understood as material realities are understood, material objects are understood. He can only be understood experientially. Now, for example, if you want to understand a frog, you can cut it open and examine it. But what if you want to understand a frog that's leaping? Then, as the French philosopher Bergson says in his book Creative Evolution, you have to stay inside the leaping frog. And that's the reason why Jesus says, abide in me and I in you. The kind of realities that I reveal to you can be understood only by entering into and abiding in them. They cannot be subjected to the kind of knowledge that people have developed, which is ideal for knowing things in their stagnation, or what is called static knowledge. Static knowledge as against dynamic knowledge. Life is dynamic. Material objects, for example, a stone, may be static. The epistemological tools or the categories of knowing and thinking that we have developed lend themselves to knowing solids, things that remain in the inert state. Knowing everything in its dynamic state is something that particularly the linguistic equipment that we have developed cannot handle properly. So I would therefore urge everyone to realize that what we are making is a humble, timid, tentative effort to understand what Jesus said. But to understand Jesus, one has to abide in him. With that as a caveat, let's proceed. Now, consider, for example, our cynicism about the teachings of Jesus Christ regarding life. Most people feel impressed, challenged by Jesus' teachings, his insights, and his prescriptions. But they pull back, saying, oh, these are wonderful but not practical. Now, this is not a reflection, in my opinion, on the feasibility or desirability of what Jesus urges us to try. Rather, it's a betrayal or a public confession, howsoever indirect, of our negativity to life. If you really value life as our supreme treasure, then surely we will not offer any excuse. We will make the best possible effort in order to attain it. A classic example is that of an athlete who is preparing for an Olympics event. He or she literally goes to the training session, dies, and comes back into life each day. Extreme, passionate investments are made into excelling in this field of sports and games. Why? Because people cherish, people value recognition at the Olympic level or even at the national level as a supreme value. So, if we value our life, then we will not look for excuses for not following the teachings of Jesus Christ regarding life, but take the plunge and see how things work out. So, our negativity to life has at least two major expressions that we can think of. One is, of course, the theme of self destruction. The number of people who kill themselves, the number of people who destroy others, who hurt themselves and others, is really mind boggling. Second aspect of this is the glorification of war and violence in every culture. What is war? War is actually the senseless destruction of life. So, war is valorized, poetized, celebrated, and upheld as a great and desirable thing for which it is right and proper for individuals to sacrifice their life. Whereas living life according to the will of God so that we enter into the fullness of its possibilities is considered impractical, which is the same as saying it is not worthwhile. Now, I find it rather strange. The soldiers are valued above mothers. Soldiers destroy life. Mothers are the bearers of new life. They are the ones who keep the species going. But for the mothers, the entire species would die. Whereas, thanks to the services of soldiers, and I don't want to downplay the value of what they do or the sacrifices they make, at least it is politically incorrect to do that. Thanks to their great and valorous efforts, a few lives or maybe a country is saved. But thanks to the labor of love that women throughout the world accept in grace and in gratitude, humanity is sustained. And it's incredible that we have no value for it. And this also actually points to something that thinkers on modern culture have spoken about in great detail. People like Herbert Marcuse and others, Eric Fromm and others, they call this the death orientation of modern culture. They say that our culture, the culture in which we live, is necrophilic, that is, in love with death rather than life. So the theme that we are developing is a profound contemporary resonance, and that is the reason why we need to pay very special attention to this. So let's proceed further with our quest or our attempt to understand what Jesus meant in saying that he is the life. It's very important. The definite article is important. He is the life. Now, I want to make a simple beginning by saying that if you look at the public ministry of Jesus Christ, He was all the time going about meeting human needs. Now, clearly, human needs fall into two categories: felt needs and unfelt needs. Which needs we feel depends on what quality of life or lack of quality of life we maintain. For example, if you have no interest in intellectual life, then you don't need books, you don't need intellectual stimulation. If you need only physical pleasures, then you would need only the means of entertainment that the world provides, so on and so forth. Why would somebody who wants to lead only a crass material existence need spiritual resources? And in this context, let's recall the words of Jesus: man does not live by bread alone. That's not true. People who live at the animal level do not need anything more than bread. So Jesus' teaching is absolutely correct in the sense that if you want to be truly human, then you need to go beyond physical bread. There is the bread of eternal life. Now, for example, the living alone have needs. A dead body has no needs, physical or spiritual. Now, if you are spiritually dead, we are spiritual corpses. You may be physically very active, very vital, but spiritually you may be dead, and therefore you're a spiritual corpse moving on two legs. Then it is unlikely that you need spiritual resources. And therefore you would always say, well, the teachings of Jesus Christ are impossible, impractical, and even undesirable. So this is the reason why Jesus said that those enigmatic words. He said, let the dead bury their deads. What does it mean? It means the dead in this context are the spiritually dead. They have no spiritual needs. So the disciples of Jesus Christ are not called to minister to people in terms of their worldly inclinations, though this is something that priests and pastors forget in our times. Under the guise of being shepherds of the people, they sort of wander into all kinds of things, as a result of which they become nothing more than glorified servants of the rich. So, let the dead bury their deads, meaning let those who have no spiritual sensitivity look after those who are worldly in their needs. You don't have to waste your time and your talent and your spiritual calling for that purpose. So, therefore, in order to understand if we are alive or dead, or if you want to understand the extent to which we are alive, in what sense we are alive, to what purpose, one thing we can do, one thing very practical we can do is to ask the question, what indeed are my needs? Make a list of your needs and see what all items figure in the list, and it would be very interesting to read that list. Try and do this for yourself. So, an important question that needs to be asked is, what is my perception of my own needs? So, the fact of the matter is, as I said in a previous unit, human beings live in a world of illusions. And illusions are eagerly embraced by people in order to make themselves blind to the real needs. Either you live in a world of illusions or you live in a world of real needs. But living in a world of real needs calls for a certain kind of discipline, which is not acceptable to you. Therefore, you embrace a world of illusions. So, according to the world in which we live, that is, whether we live in a world of illusions or in a world of real needs, our perception of what we really need will be determined. So that's why Jesus says man does not live by bread alone. Therefore, the question that we need to ask ourselves today is, do we really have any higher needs? Do we? If we have higher needs, what sort of needs? Let's make a list now of our higher needs. And then, against each need, prepare a note. How am I meeting those needs? Are my higher needs met within the system that I have accepted for myself, including the ecclesial system, the church arrangement, the so-called church fellowship? Are my spiritual needs really met? I'm not suggesting that you should run away from your church. This is immediately misunderstood. I'm only saying that we have a right to have our spiritual needs met. And they can well be met if only church life is designed differently. And why shouldn't we push for it? That's the question. That's the point I'm raising. So, uh, now, let's now ask another important question. Why did Jesus have to come into this world as the harbinger of life? After all, the main thing that Jesus identifies with his life and his personality is life. And he says, I have come that they, which all people everywhere in the world, now and forever, may have life in its fullness. If life was a natural, spontaneous, automatic choice of people, it is superfluous for Jesus to come into this world in order to challenge people to accept life and life in its fullness. It's completely unnecessary. But there is an imperious need for Jesus to do so, especially given the risks involved, because life, unfortunately, strange as it might seem, life, unfortunately, is not people's natural or spontaneous choice. And this is something in regard to which each one of us has to examine ourselves. Are we oriented to life, or are we oriented to death? And the insight we get from the story of the Garden of Eden, is that human beings, since the time of Adam and Eve, are oriented to death rather than life. Because God said to Adam, do not eat of the fruit of this tree, for the day you eat thereof, you will surely die. That is to say, you come under the death principle, or what we call the death orientation. Thereafter, all that you do in this world, in fact, even the actions and projects that you undertake with the best of your conscious intentions, may be pulling you closer, and nearer to death. So, this is something against which we all have to remain vigilant. Good intentions are not enough in the domain of religious life, or life in general. There is no guarantee that lurking beneath our good intentions, of which we are unawares to ourselves, there is this death principle operating all the time. Now, therefore, uh, Jesus needed to come into this world to address the reality, the harsh reality, the painful reality of the death orientation of human nature. And therefore, we need to understand this a little more clearly. Now, from the third book of Genesis, the very first book in the Bible, we read that after Adam and Eve disobeyed God and alienated themselves from the love of God, they do something very strange. They go and hide themselves. Now, this is a poetic, symbolic way of saying that people from now onwards will hide themselves from life. After all, what is God? God is life. God is a fountain spring of life. So hiding from God means hiding from life. And this is going to be the overall innate feature of human nature. And it's against this that various spiritual interventions in the human predicament, human condition, happened across generations. And therefore, in my view, the various religious traditions are not competing hostile elements. They are actually fellow pilgrims, walking one after the other, seeking an answer to this most tormenting existential issue. Why is it that human beings who apparently love life choose death rather than life? All spiritual traditions address this particular enigma one way or another. So, therefore, we have to really take cognizance of two fundamental problems when it comes to understanding the human attitude to life. Uh, since the time of Adam and Eve, a mode of life contrary to what God envisaged for human beings has come into being. God created human beings in his image and likeness, and therefore the divine element is very real, it's very basic to being human. And that divine element must be the defining aspect of our life. But once we move away from God, that vacuum is filled by something else. And that's the overall principle of the world. So walk out of God, you enter the world, and I have repeatedly said that the world we have created for ourselves is a world of illusions. So from life based on truth, the light of truth, we move into a life based on illusions and the darkness thereof. Now, the second thing, once we enter the world of illusions, which in Hindu philosophy, religious, spiritual worldview is called Maya. Maya doesn't mean that everything in the world is unreal. It means that the relationship that we create with everything that we see in the physical world is unreal, is unhelpful, is ungodly, unspiritual. Maya. So, once we enter this world of illusions, something very interesting happens. And it's so very important for us to understand. Particularly, I appeal to young people to understand this principle as clearly as they can. That is, once we are in the world of illusions, a terrible dogma operates on us. Don't think that dogma is present only in the sphere of religion. In fact, secular dogmas are even more powerful and persuasive, and secular dogmas also include scientific dogmas. There is no sphere of human activity free from dogmas. That's not my central concern, therefore let me not go more into that direction. Now, the dogma that this world of illusion thrusts upon you is, and please remember this, the dogma that there is no other way. There is no other way. No other way than the way that we can give to you, the way that we have evolved, the way of the world. So when Jesus says, I am the way, which is a subject we have already considered, what it means is that Jesus presents himself in contrast to the settled way of the world. And he challenges the world's dogma that there is no other way than the way of the world. And the way that Jesus presents in contrast to the way of the world is the way of life. So the way of death and the way of life. And we are given the freedom to choose between the two. So Jesus' triumphant affirmation, which is good news for all human beings, all of humankind, is that there is another way. And this principle comes to the fore in the temptations of Jesus Christ. There, if you study the dynamics that Satan presents, is this. Satan so manages the three temptations as to make Jesus believe, or to delude Jesus into believing that there is only one way, and that's the way that Satan suggests. For example, you are hungry, you have the power to turn stones into loaves of bread. Please do that. That's the only way. You want to attain popularity? Don't worry. There is a way. Go to the top of the temple, jump from there, come down unscathed. Immediately thousands, tens and thousands will flock to you. That is the way. There is no other way. Take Jesus to the top of the mountain, show him the glories of the world, and say, bend down and worship me and I will give you all of this. There is no other way. That is the dogma of the world. So, the world confronts us or tries to delude us into this dogma, and Jesus liberates us from the tyranny of this deadly or death-oriented worldly dogmas. So the liberating truths that we find in Jesus Christ is, or the liberating truth that Jesus has brought into this world is, that the dogma of the world, that this is the only way, is utterly untrue. There is, thank God, another way. That's the way of life. So, therefore then, let's consider the hallmarks of Jesus as the way of life. Jesus as the way of life. Jesus addresses a major misconception in the worldly understanding of life, and that is, and all of us are subject to this misconception or this illusion, that only what is happening out there in the bold, brave world, in the wide, wide world, is real and exciting and significant. And all of our perceptions are actually tyrannized over and distorted by this misconception. And it is incredible the extent to which this misconception rules over us. And therefore, without our knowing it, we are simply dragged into the public sphere, where we are acted upon by all kinds of forces alien to us. The result is that we become empty within and we become miserable. So, the obsession in which we live with the external world results from this illusion. And that illusion makes us neglect as well as discount our inner life. Now, put very simply, the spiritual revolution that Jesus Christ came to bring about is a shift from or a liberation from our obsession with, as well as liberation from the illusions of the world, to the discovery of incomparable inner power, inner resources. And in that relationship, God becomes central. It is really self deceiving and hypocritical to pretend that in the kind of worldly life we lead, God is central to our life. It can never be. Absolutely not. The world is central to us. But the moment we shift our emphasis from worldly achievements, worldly fame, worldly rewards, to the inner sanctuary of our life, where we are one with God and experience our personality, our life entirely differently, then our spiritual life becomes real, and that is the real life. That real life, of course, is lived in this world, but the quality of the life that we live upon the same earth changes very dramatically. And that's the idea of transformation. That's the idea of people becoming a new creation. So, uh, the world out there is not a sphere of life, it's a sphere of death orientation. Life goes on, but the orientation is that of death. And Jesus calls us into life. And if you look at the life and teachings of Jesus Christ, you will find a consistent emphasis on delinking ourselves or liberating ourselves from our total slavery or bondage to the world outside, including the craving to show off in public, religious life being a display of human vanity, etc., something that I wanted to refer to, and which is so very obvious in the teachings of Jesus Christ, to finding a new realm of truth in the life within, in communion with God. So, therefore, in the spiritual context, we are placed between two options. One is to live by the resources of the world alone, with the consequences that follow. Second is to live by these inner resources which God continuously replenishes, provided we let Him to do so. And these inner resources can be gained only through an ongoing fellowship or companionship with Jesus Christ. And therefore, being rooted in God is a source of sustaining ourselves, and that's a source of our continuing nourishment in our spiritual life. This is the source of our strength, which enables us to meet the challenges of life in this world with confidence and courage. So, therefore, Jesus is our role model in this, role model of a life lived with the orientation towards God, which is the orientation to life. And therefore, the most visible aspect of Jesus's life, and that is his total independence from material resources. You remember what Jesus said about himself? The foxes have their holes, the birds in the air have their nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. That's the extent of his independence from, or freedom from dependence on material provisions or worldly provisions. That is a state of pure freedom. The extent to which you depend on others, depend on external means and resources, is also the extent of your bondage. That's the reason why, from time immemorial, it has been accepted as universally true that the less you have, the freer you become. So wealth becomes a kind of existential prison. This is something that Jesus explained in great detail. Therefore, I don't have to repeat those things. If you are even marginally familiar with the teachings of Jesus Christ, in their literal dimension alone, if not in their deep spiritual meanings, you will immediately recall those passages. So, living according to the patterns and provisions of the world is unfreedom, because whatever is external to us, to the extent that we depend on them, will control and manipulate us. This is a universal principle. There can be no exception to this. Please remember, to depend on anything or anyone external to you is to compromise your freedom and dignity, and it's also to erode your personality. Therefore, the more we de-link ourselves from dependence on external means, the freer we are. Now, I'm not saying, therefore, that we should not have basic facilities of life. I'm only saying that we should not deem any facility in the world as indispensable. There's only one source of strength that's indispensable, and that's God. Period. And that is the mark of pure freedom. If everything else falls away, and if our relationship with God endures, God's grace is sufficient for us in all our needs. That is the mark, that is the yardstick of freedom. So, in order to understand this, let's consider a biblical example. Saul was a very zealous Pharisee. And when he was a Pharisee, he went about persecuting Christians. Mark the next words: under the authority of the high priest. He couldn't do it by himself. He needed to have authorization from the high priest. So he was a slave of the high priest, but he did not realize it. He thought he was exercising and exuding power. He had the power of life and death, as it were. So he thought he was doing mighty well. But gradually, the sad realization dawned on him, and one day, as he was on the road to Damascus, the loving person of Jesus accosted him, and the rest is history. So, the transformation that comes into the person of Saul as he is transformed into Paul is the transformation from death to life, or death orientation to life orientation. Had Saul remained the zealous Pharisee, what would have been the content and quality of his experiences as compared to what they become once he is oriented to life in Jesus Christ? So, let's move on. The second aspect of Jesus as the way of life is that Jesus insists on fullness of life. Now, fullness is not something that we associate with our life, which must more accurately be described as existence, mere existence. What falls short of fullness is not life, it's mere existence. And therefore, Jesus emphasizes the need and the right that people are given by God to enter into life in its fullness. Now, this fullness is not quantitative. As Luke in his Gospel, I think it's chapter 12, says, the life of a man does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. So, fullness of life should never be understood in quantitative terms. If anything, it's qualitative. So, this qualitative fullness pertains to the creativity dimension of humankind. The most significant aspect of being human is creativity. Why? Because we are created in the image and likeness of God. God is creator, and therefore we are creative. We cannot but be creative. To the extent that we are alive, we would become creative. We may not be creative in the form of an artist, a painter, a dancer, a singer, etc. But we can be creative in relation to life, which I believe is the highest form of creativity. And that's the kind of creativity that we find manifested in Jesus Christ. And it's because Jesus was creative in his spiritual life that he became an agent of transformation for human beings, whoever came into contact with him, except those who were resolutely turned away from life and were oriented to death. So, creativity, therefore, is the power to manifest the hidden. So, the life that is given to us is not fully hidden. We are given the rudiments of life, the embryonic life, or what the 17th century philosopher Baruch Spinoza called the dispositions to life, the seeds of life. Now, then we are given the opportunity to sow these seeds and produce an abundant harvest of life. That's actually the arrangement that God has created. Now, to understand this creativity, let's even look at creativity as it is understood in the world or as it is manifest in the world. Think of a sculptor. He takes a piece of stone. What does he do? He goes on chipping away, chipping away, chipping away. And he liberates an image of beauty that's lying hidden in that block of stone or a piece of metal or whatever, piece of wood, whichever material medium he chooses to work with. And once he reveals that, the value of that piece of wood goes up by 1,000,000 times. That is creativity. That's why I say that creativity can redeem us from our dependence on quantity. And this is clearly illustrated in the parable of the talents. It doesn't matter that you get 5 talents or 2 talents. What's important is what you do with it, how creative you are in managing. And if you're creative, these talents will multiply in your hands. If you're not creative, you will go and bury it, and the talent will become the means of your condemnation. So, when we are creative, therefore, we look at everything that is given to us as the stepping ladder to a higher state. Just as a sculptor takes a block of stone in which we see no possibilities, and then he reaches a higher level of achievement. So also, if we are creative in our life, we'll see every opportunity, every situation, every individual given to us as an invitation to a higher quality, a higher state of life. And that is when our life becomes full in the spiritual sense of the term. So, in contrast, of course, we can stay with our eyes closed, willfully blind to all the possibilities and potentialities of life, and then go on complaining, oh, life has given me a raw deal. Oh, I'm like this. What do I have? I'm such a miserable creature. I have no talents. God has been unkind to me. Leading a life of resentment, grievances, and smoldering sense of underprivilege is the living hell to which we consign ourselves when we do not develop our capacity to be human, which is open to all people universally, if only they care for it. If we don't develop this seed of creativity in being human, then the only option is we degrade our life into a burden and we waste a lifetime complaining against the Creator. So, it's an astounding mark of Jesus' creativity that he transformed the cross, which was an object of aversion to all people till then. And to the Jews, it is even today an object of aversion. Jesus transformed this object of universal aversion into a symbol of life and of hope. That is the mark of creativity. That, given that capacity, is it any wonder that Jesus transformed the lives of those who came to him? Jesus transformed judicial murder into sacrifice. The Jews, in collaboration with the Romans, were actually murdering Jesus under pretext of fulfilling the requirement of law. That trial was a mockery. The decision to crucify Jesus was nothing but a piece of judicial murder. But Jesus had the power, spiritual power, the life orientation to transform this judicial murder into sacrifice. What is sacrifice? Sacrifice is fundamentally what enriches life. So, Jesus' death on the cross is not a loss but a gain for life. Life in the capital, L-I-F-E, L capital. And that is the power of Jesus as the way of life. So, Jesus is therefore to us an invitation to be creative about life in general and dealing with every situation in the course of our life in a creative manner. Now, finally, a continuation of this thought, Jesus' attitude to death is the ultimate proof, and that would sound a paradox, the ultimate proof of his divine, challenging commitment to life. To me, I don't need a further proof that Jesus is the light of life except the way he faced death. Jesus is not racked and tormented by the terror of death. What does he do? The amazing thing. On the cross of Calvary, he turns his death into an affectionate handing over of his life to God the Father in faith, in thanksgiving, in celebration. Because a while ago, a short while before that, he said, it's fulfilled. It's fulfilled. So therefore, the victory over death that Jesus offers, the Bible says that Jesus removed the sting of death. What is the sting of death? The sting of death, I must emphasize this, the sting of death is nothing but futility of life. Death is nothing in itself. The terror that we read on the face of death is nothing but the vacuum, the emptiness, the futility of the life that we live. To those who live life its fullness, and that's possible only when life is lived in communion with God. Those who live life in its fullness will experience death as an aspect of the fulfillment and completion of life, and therefore will enter into it with an air of celebration. And that's what Jesus did. So Jesus' attitude to death is something that challenges me no end. And that to me is the ultimate and clinching proof that he was the light of life. And therefore, if we want to cultivate this attitude to death, at least if we want to insure ourselves against the terror of death in the last moment, all we have to do is to cultivate life in its abundance, to live life in its fullness, which is the quintessence of Jesus' spiritual mission, to lead us into that state. That's how Jesus removes the sting of death. It's not in a magical kind of way, it's a logical kind of way. If we live life as Jesus lived, then we will not be terrorized by death. Death itself can be turned into a sacrament of handing over oneself to God. So therefore, now that in the light of all that we have considered so far, of course there is much more to be said in this. My effort here is only to give a foretaste of what you can actually achieve for yourself. Let's ask some questions to ourselves. First of all, are we living or are we merely existing according to the way of the world? What is our state? In which category would we place ourselves? Clearly, if you go by the example of Jesus, to live is to celebrate life. The life that God created is a festival. Life is a festival. Human beings have this kind of intuition, but they can't accept the full implications thereof. Therefore, what do? They create festivals, sporadic festivals, now and then a festival. And this is nothing but the secret intuition that life itself needs to be a festival. But we are incapable of that, and therefore the best thing we can do for ourselves is to have a date set apart in the calendar for festivals. No, spiritually, life, the whole of life is a festival. Second question that we need to ask ourselves is, do we have a sense of gratitude to God that we find in Jesus Christ? Why are we disabled in respect of the capacity for gratitude? Why do we find it so difficult to feel and express the spontaneous, overwhelming gratitude to God, who is the giver of everything that we have and everything that we are, which is even more important? Now, frankly, our incapacity for gratitude is a mere reflection of our negativity to life our incapacity for life. And therefore, we must take this aspect of our disability, our spiritual disability, very seriously, namely our disability to be grateful to God. I mean, human beings experience belatedly a sort of nostalgic gratitude when they become old, and looking back, they realize, oh, I was young and it was so glorious to be young. I had I had two pair of wonderful eyes. I never thanked God for it. God gave me a wonderful heart, which is the most amazing piece of engineering in the world. Human beings, even today, have not created a pump which can vary its output from half a horsepower to 0.01 horsepower and work without rest for 70 years, 80 years, 90 years, 100 years. Human beings have not invented anything like this. I have that. God gave me, put it free of cost into my chest, so on and so forth. If you really look at it, everything about you, everything even about your body, is a cause for celebration and gratitude. But we never experience this. Why is it that we are so challenged? We are gratitude challenged, like, visually challenged. Huh? Why is it that? It's nothing but a reflection of our incapacity to life. Those who are living life in its fullness will have a spirit of gratitude overflowing their being all the time. The entire life will be a song of gratitude to God, and that will become infectious. So, furthermore, let's ask the question, what are the resources by which we are living today? To what extent do we need spiritual or godly resources? Surely, if you don't need them, and if you're indifferent to them, it means only one thing, that we merely exist and we are short of Jesus' mark of life in its fullness. Finally, do we fear death? Do we understand why we fear death? And do we accept the fact that we don't have to live in fear of death? That death also can be an aspect of the celebration of life. And do we realize that in order to attain that state, it is necessary to lead our life according to the will of God, which is when our life attains its fullness. So, Jesus, as the way of life, is an invitation for each one of us to live life in its fullness. So, in 4 sessions now, we have dealt with one particular statement by Jesus Christ about himself. And this is justified because this is a central statement about his being, the significance and scope of the person of Jesus Christ. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I hope our journey together in 4 sessions has given to those who are viewing this series with some degree of attention and involvement some insights into what it means to be oriented to life rather than death. And I don't have to argue it ad nauseum that being oriented to life rather than being oriented to death is a wiser state and a wiser option to accept. So Jesus is first and foremost a call to life, and he is the guarantee that we can attain life in all its fullness. May each one of us be blessed through these insights that God in his mercy has given to us through his blessed Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. Thank you.